Mary is a Jungian astrologer, but she's also an Egyptologist, and she has more than 20 years' experience with psychology and metaphysics and world mythologies. So she's described as an archaeoastrologer, and she's very much specialized in ancient Egypt and Peru. And I know many people that have had wonderful readings with her. She's wonderful at helping people to clarify their soul's purpose, focusing upon karmic relationship patterns, past life experiences, talents, and future potential. That's all described by the birth chart. And, really combining astrological vision and intuitive guidance, she really helps people to engage in personal transformation. She's lived and worked in Egypt, where she received her degree in Egyptology, and she leads incredibly interesting trips to Egypt and Peru. She's also researching the archaeological and astronomical connections between these fascinating two ancient civilizations. And so Mary began Pachitera travel as a way to share her love of sacred site travel and Mother Earth with like minded people. And I want to just remind our listeners that if they would like to read more about Mary, they can visit her website. It's Pachitera, PACHATERRA.com. Well, Mary, welcome to the show.
Well, hello, Steve, and thank you, my esteemed friend and colleague and fellow astrologer. How are you?
I'm doing well, Mary. I'm excited to have you on the show, and particularly before you embark upon your next incredible trip to Egypt. And I wanted to mention that to our listeners to begin with, Mary, because I know that you lead these incredible and magical tours to Egypt. Can you tell us just briefly about your next trip, which is available to people that are interested, so they can go on this trip if they want to? Tell us a little bit about what you have planned.
Well, yes, of course. Thank you, Steve. And just as a quick addendum, I will be in your neck of the woods also in Nashville and Knoxville over the next week or two. So hopefully I'll get to see you and talk to some more people up there. What I'm doing with the November 2014 trip is actually doing an immersion, so that we're going deeply into the spiritual as well as the archaeology aspects of ancient Egypt. And I've amended the normal 14-day tour with a cruise and everything, so that people can actually come and spend a full 9 days just in Luxor and Abydos, because I've had a lot of special requests for that over the past few years. And this is a great time to be in Egypt for two reasons. One, there's no crowds. It's, the tourism is low, which is, not great for the Egyptian side of things, but for us who want to do work specifically in certain sites and temples, it's pretty much wide open right now. And also, due to the same factor as it is not being overrun with tourists, there's a reduced cost aspect, which makes it very attractive to most people right now. So, getting that little blurb out of the way, what we're doing in this particular trip is going for 11/11. We'll be in Cairo at the Sphinx and the Pyramids for November the 11th, and then we're moving on to Luxor and Abydos and doing a full I call it the immersion journey. Some people call it initiation. To me, it's an immersion, because we really are deeply part of the matrix of ancient Egypt, as well as focused on the culture and the aspects of what's going on in terms of how the people live. And it's a cultural, we live on the West Bank, and we stay and go back and forth between the East Bank and the West Bank of the Nile. I have a house there, so people get to actually use that space as meditation with the Blue Lotus. So it's kind of a multi-dimensional, faceted tour, and really, if people want more information, they could go to my website, as you said, at pachitera.com, or they can just email me, Mary Lomando, and they can find everything they need to know. But I really do feel that Egypt right now is going through a transformational process, not just on the physical level, but there's a whole new grid. There's an etheric grid that's awakening, and that has been going on since the end of 2012. But as we're moving forward with all of these, as you know, as an astrologer, all of these grand trines and squares and amazing galactic alignments, what we're doing is we're actually pulling through more and more of the starry lineage that belongs to Egypt, and awakening that thread in us as humans. So it's just, and it's fun, to state the obvious.
Sounds it. Sounds incredible. Well, Mary, you mentioned the Blue Lotus, and I know that you are the person that reintroduced the Blue Lotus. So you actually are growing the Blue Lotus again in Egypt, which is incredible in itself. But can I ask you to explain to our listeners what the Blue Lotus symbolizes for Egypt and for all of us?
Well, as we know from the ancient Egyptian texts and the Book of the Dead, and also what's actually left to us in terms of the temple iconography and wall reliefs and paintings and tomb paintings, all of that good stuff that we can still see with our third-dimensional eyes, the Egyptians revered the blue lotus as the flower of immortality. And that saying where it takes a village to raise a child, it's kind of the same thing there. This is a team effort. There is a Blue Lotus Foundation with some really excellent people involved in this, and it is reintroducing it in the local environs. Back in the day, in Roman times, the flower itself was not propagated the way it was in the dynastic times of ancient Egypt, and it sort of went by the wayside. It is now growing and flourishing, and so we do believe that that's a symbol that there is a new awakening, that there is a new blossoming, that the new life force is being evolved, and Egypt is a portal. It's a doorway to many different dimensional gateways, or stargates, if you will. And the idea of, in many ancient religions and philosophies, the lotus is always sacred, and it usually symbolizes the crown chakra. And in Egypt, it was the same. And it's this idea of, if you can come up, it grows in the mud, comes up from the earth itself. And as we're part earth, and the part of us that is spiritual grows towards the light, opens to our divinity, and become one with the Godhead. That's universal in many ancient cultures, and the lotus is the symbol. In Egypt, we are lucky enough to be able to walk into a temple and see it, and now hopefully someday, when there is, let's say, more of a standardized government that's willing to accept this in terms of antiquities and placing it and all of that stuff that goes with 3 dimensions, then we will be able to place those back in the sacred lakes and the temples once again. But for right now, symbolically, it's holding space for that new etheric grid that we've been talking about, which is happening all over the planet. But especially in Egypt, it's very potent, extremely potent at this point in time. So we are very fortunate and blessed to be able to have that Blue Lotus and be able to work with it and meditate with it there in Luxor.
It's wonderful, Mary. It's wonderful that you're doing that. Absolutely fascinating. I want to go back in time, Mary. I know obviously that you're an Egyptologist. I've always been very interested in the ancient Egyptian mystery schools and the process of initiation into the mysteries. Can you take us back in time and teach us a little about these ancient mystery schools?
Well, I think that might take us a lot more than the 40 or 50 minutes we have on the air. I'd love to take you back to Egypt, Steve. Someday that would be a great way to do it. In the few minutes that we, the few minutes that we have, it was interesting because many different. We think of Egypt as in our. Again, our Western mind as ancient Egypt as one kind of lump sum, if you will. But really, Egypt was spread out over thousands of years, and the different mystery schools, if you will, had different points of time and were devoted to different temples. And as we look at the Egyptian mysteries today in the Western mystical tradition, they come to us through the Greco-Roman period, through Greece mostly. So even that's been kind of tampered with a little bit and Hellenized. The ancient Egyptian mysteries, as the Egyptians knew it, probably come to us through Atlantis. And as we know, these epochs that we talk about are so far back in time that there really is no written documentation of this, and there's a lot of channeled information, there's a lot of esoteric information, but the idea of what a particular initiation was, no one really knows. I would assume that the closest we would get to it, even after years of study, is knowing that at some point that the initiates did go into the Great Pyramid of Giza, and that was considered very important in terms of overcoming death and becoming this idea of an immortal, light-bodied being. We see remnants of this even into Christian times when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus the Christ. There are so many parallels with the ancient Egyptian mystery schools and early Gnosticism and Christianity that we could go on and on just talking about that. But the idea, the most important thing in ancient Egypt was this idea of the raw material, if you will, of the human. Let's call it that lotus seed in the mud. It's this idea of you come and you grow and you evolve, and through a transformational process of spending many years attached to a particular temple or a particular deity with a masterful teacher who showed you the way and guided you through the ranks, through sheer self-discipline and trial and error and the willingness of the spirit and the heart to open, something flowered, something woke up, and that was the individual coming forth into the light. Now, most of the time that took years, and in some cases is lifetimes before that would actually be completed. Again, one of the things that's very interesting about being able to physically go into Egypt is usually an individual can somehow access past life information and individually retrace their steps. I call it opening the Hall of Records. I mean, most of us have past life remembrances, or we've been through regressions, and so we've kind of put together our own story in terms of past lives by the time we get to this stage of the game, because I'm sure most of your listeners are pretty well are familiar with metaphysical principles and different readings and past life information and so forth. So this idea is we're looking at two things. One is that the ancient Egyptians had a very prescribed method of doing it, very sacred, very hierarchical. It's like there was stages, and we see that even now in modern day Freemasonry. You don't go from stage 0 to 33. There are ways and means and ranks and initiations to pass to get to those. Now, in our modern everyday spiritual world, we don't have many of us, I should say. There are a few who do have the prescribed ranks and the rituals and the initiations depending on the orders that they belong to. But for most mainstream people, we are going by this really pretty much on our own steam. And so the best guide is to keep an open heart and to just really follow your intuition and to see where your interest lies in terms of a pathway. And if people are interested in ancient Egypt, there are many books written and so many different ways to go. I have a lot of students who find that they become interested in ancient Egypt and the magical initiation world through the goddess Isis and through reading books by Dion Fortune or getting into it through alchemy or astrology. Everyone's path is different, but one of the things I like to say to students when they start is that pretty much anything that you're studying in the Western magical tradition comes from ancient Egypt.
Interesting. It's very, very interesting. I want to ask you, Mary, about the library in Alexandria. So we hear these stories of this incredible library that contained an enormous amount of information relating to metaphysics. Can you tell us a little bit about the library and what happened to that knowledge?
Well, again, it was an amazing place. Sometimes I like to go back in my own, inner hall of records and kind of fantasize about walking around through those arcane halls of the Library of Alexandria. I think I probably did spend some time there. But the idea is that there was a movement after Alexander the Great died, and Ptolemy, his general, who inherited Egypt as his part of the empire that was divided up on Alexander's deathbed. And the Library of Alexandria was built not only to house what was the most important texts and writings of all the Egyptian culture that they had up until that time, but also Ptolemy gathered books from all over the empire. And remember that Alexander had conquered all the way to India. And so they were gathering texts from Greece, from Iran, Persia. They were gathering books as far east as India. The idea was to make Alexandria a learning center of the world, a capital of the world, and that's what the lighthouse symbolized. Remember the ancient Egyptian idea of coming forth into light. Light equals knowledge. And so Ptolemy prided himself on being this gatherer of this knowledge, and he started the school there at the library, and it was very much modeled on the Greek philosophers who those particular generals of Alexander had studied with Socrates and Plato and so forth. So the arcane school of Alexandria was famous throughout the known world at that time, and people came from all over. They had Hasidic scholars and many, many different people studying there. And the idea was it was an ecumenical council of people. It just wasn't one nationality or one brand of knowledge. It was universal. And that continued all through the time of Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the seventh Cleopatra, and her ancestry goes way back to Ptolemy I with the founding of the city of Alexandria. So we're looking at literary heritage that was esoteric, spiritual, and historical all at the same time. And the closest we would probably come to it today would either be the Vatican Library or the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. But it was vast, and it was a huge academia universal light. There were many reasons why it was not allowed to continue on after a certain period of time. There was major rifts between the Christians and the Platonic scholars in Alexandria, and mainly the Christians were not really, they believed that the library was a pagan institution and shouldn't be allowed to exist. And so the scholars were persecuted, in particular Hypatia, who was a very renowned woman scholar, astronomer, and scientist of the time, was put to death very brutally. And so little by little, the door closed. Always in great periods of enlightenment, there's a huge window that opens so that humanity can make that leap, much like the window that's open right now in the 21st century of humankind. But what happens is that the shadow comes in, and it is all about ignorance and fanaticism and making their way the only way. And unfortunately, the Great Library of Alexandria did not survive what happened during the changeover from the time of, called the procession of the equinoxes, from the age of Aries into the age of Pisces. Now, they say during the time of Cleopatra, Julius Caesar had some naval battle going on in the port there, and that some of the library caught fire and burned. But the idea was that it wasn't all systematically wiped out in one fell swoop. It took time for it to degenerate in a sense, where it wasn't actually the texts that were burned and destroyed. It was the scholars that had to go underground and had to take their teachings elsewhere. Nowadays, about 4 or 5 years ago, the government of Egypt built the Antiquities Department under the auspices of Dr. Zahi Hawass, built an amazingly beautiful new library, pretty much devoted to the same principles. But unfortunately, the revolution in 2011 kind of put a lid on some of it. We're, always looking optimistically at the future, and where that library once stood, the new library stands again. So again, that is a very hopeful sign for the future.
Mary, for those of our listeners that like to read, that like to research and delve into these fascinating sources of information, what's the closest we can get nowadays to the kind of material that would have been available or stored in the library in Alexandria? Do you have any recommendations for us?
Well, I think, I'm a little prejudiced in this. I say go back to the classics and read the authors that were writing about this when Egypt was new. People like Wallace Budge, and there are that beautiful book by Doreo called The Emerald Tablets of Thoth, if you want an idea of how the ancient Egyptians and dynastic Alexandrians actually taught. They taught in parables with some very unique language. Another book that I always like to go back to, which is kind of like my textbook for all things, is called The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly Hall.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
when we talk to you must know that book as well, Steve.
What an amazing man! What an amazing man! He's one of those people that you would choose, isn't he? That if you really could have dinner with somebody that's no longer here, he's one of those people that would be high on the list.
Exactly. And as people are getting into their own research, it's like if you pick out someone like that and then you look at someone who's classic and noteworthy for the work and the research that they did, then there's a long list of footnotes and collaborators, and you can index all that from reading one book. You can find out where your interest lies. I'm pretty much of that Alexandrian method of teaching. I don't really like to tell people too much about what to do, but the idea is there if you're looking for something. That's part of your quest. That's part of the initiation, is to follow your path. But in modern day, writers who are excellent in terms of piecing together some of these ancient wisdoms are people like John Anthony West, who's brilliant and written all about the sacred science of ancient Egypt, the symbolist theory. There are so many books on Egypt. It's like, looking at pebbles of sand on the beach. You can start anywhere and just keep going. But depending on what your interest is, if people are interested in the alignment of the Great Pyramids and the astronomy of the cycles, and someone like Robert Bauval, a modern-day writer, is really good, and start with his Orion Mystery. There's many, many places to look for information on Egypt. The idea of and you probably know more about this than I do, researching the alchemical side of Egypt, you want to look into the Gnostic writers and some of the more Platonic Greek writers, and some of that takes you into books written in the Middle Ages. So it depends on how intense somebody's research nose is and how deep they want to go with it. But I'm happy to, again, if anybody emails me or finds me on Facebook or goes to my website, I'm happy to answer any and all questions pertaining to book lists about Egypt and all kinds of things. Usually if I'm teaching a class, it takes about a week to assemble a bibliography because there's just so many fascinating books about Egypt.
Amazing place, incredible place. Well, tell us, Mary, how does Thoth fit into all of this? We hear the name Thoth so frequently. Where does Thoth fit in? Who is Thoth?
Well, Thoth is the Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, and all things magical in terms of written work. So when we think of the hieroglyph, we think of on one level, a very third-dimensional notation of characters denoting Egyptian ideas, like we have letters in an alphabet. On another level, the idea of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs is that they're awakening something in the human mind, and as you perceive these forms, and they take you into, it's like having a code to take you into other levels of experience. And sometimes I've seen people stand in front of the hieroglyphs in Egypt, either on an obelisk or a wall or something, and get totally mesmerized. Thoth is the one who is purported to be the inventor of that language. Now, Thoth, as an ancient Egyptian archetypal netter or god, is also associated with astrology. He's associated with numbers, anything that comes along the science of mathematics. He's the be-all, end-all of all knowledge and wisdom in ancient Egypt. Some people believe that Thoth was a real being, that he actually was a physical incarnation on the planet who had come from Atlantis, and that he was, it comes to us as kind of a legend that he was instrumental in bringing a codified field of literature, language, and learning into Egypt from the civilization of Atlantis. Now, you can look at it that way. Some people think that Thoth is a being from another planet. Some people think that it is an age-old title, that it was a priesthood, that you inherited the title Thoth, and that Imhotep, the original Grand Vizier back in Third Dynasty Egypt, who is the one who built the first pyramid in Egypt, the stepped pyramid, that he was associated or synonymous with Thoth. Now, we can look at this many different ways. That's the great thing about Egypt. Everywhere you look in Egypt, there is a mystery. It's like, there's no stone unturned when it comes to finding mysteries. So whichever way we look at it, the Thoth is all about language, mathematics, higher mind information, and how it relates to the human condition. He has whole temples ascribed to his works, specifically the main one in Edfu talks about 9 books that were written and ascribed to Thoth. So we're looking at him in terms of the father of alchemy, the father of writing, and the father of magic, and that's just 3 of the titles. We can go on and on. I mean, if there's anything specific that you'd like, or you think maybe your listeners would like to know, I'd be happy to pick up on one specific.
Well, I think you need to be our go-to person for reading suggestions, for sure, for research. If we need a good book to read, we'll have to get in touch with you and find out about all of these incredible things, Mary. I want to ask you about new discoveries, Mary. I know that you've got your finger on the pulse. You know what's going on, and we've all heard at some time or another of an archaeological discovery in Egypt. But can you tell us about the latest discoveries?
Well, it is interesting that there have been so many since basically what we hear in the West, especially in the United States, is all of the political news that goes on in Egypt. But interestingly enough, since the revolution, there have been more and more discoveries made because the archaeologists have had much more time and the freedom to go in there and kind of look around and excavate in places. There have been, especially in Abydos, entirely amazing discoveries going on. In fact, this year, they found a whole new pharaonic dynasty that they weren't sure even existed, and it's now confirmed. Pretty much during the middle period of Egypt, they had pharaohs who were living in the environment of Abydos as secondary rulers, while the Hyksos, who were invaders in the north, ruled from the northern part of Egypt. And it was kind of like a rebellion going on in the south until they finally overthrew the invaders in the 17th, 18th dynasty. However, this dynasty in Abydos that was just found is considered second intermediate, which is like 15th dynasty, and no one really knew who these pharaohs were. And suddenly, a few months ago, the University of Pennsylvania, I believe, started to excavate tombs where they re-excavate, where they knew who was buried, and they found some subsidiary tombs where they had never had any idea at all for burials. So it was really exciting on that level. Also, there are places on the West Bank that were excavated many years ago and then kind of, written up, and the archaeologists moved on. Now they're finding that underneath some of those tombs, especially the 18th dynasty tombs connected to the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, they are finding tombs below those tombs that are, actually containing grave goods and mummies and things that haven't been seen in Egypt in a long time. So if you're interested in archaeology, it's extremely fascinating. Where my house is, I live pretty much on the West Bank in Luxor, close to all of the archaeological excavations going on, and within a stone's throw, there's like 4 or 5 concessions, and as you walk down the street going to the grocery store, you can see people digging and working and finding stuff. It's incredible. It reminds me of the old days when Carter was in Egypt, and people were just all over the West Bank doing lots of things, excavation-wise, where for many years the excavations were pretty rigidly controlled, so there wasn't a lot of overt activity. But the past 2 summers, there have been a lot of archaeologists, especially American and Spanish, just really retooling the whole place, and they found some very interesting stuff. A couple of months ago, we saw in the on the internet and in the certain archaeology magazines the huge statues that were found, which were colossi, and they have now erected them, and they're standing, in right there on the West Bank where they found them.
Wow.
So the whole place is kind of like an open-air museum right now.
Wow, well, that sounds magical. Well, Mary, we're going to take a short commercial break just for a moment, and then we will come back and we'll be asking you more questions.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Well, Mary, I'm really enjoying the interview. You're extremely knowledgeable. I guess we would need a year with you really to just start to scratch the surface of your knowledge. And the trip to Egypt sounds absolutely fascinating. So I'll ask you a little bit more about that before we end the interview later on. But I do want to ask you about Suchata. You mentioned Suchata in an email to me, and I haven't heard of her. So I was interested to ask you if you could explain to us who Suchata is and why she's important.
Yes, well, fantastic, Steve. And I'm so glad you brought her up because she's actually the consort, the female counterpart of the god Thoth. So as we have Thoth as the god of letters and magic and science, we have Sashada as the feminine counterpart, and she's called the mistress of the Hall of Records. And her specific task is she aligns the architectural guidelines when there's a temple to be erected. She's the one she's like the sacred architect, and she aligns with the stars. It's like if the pharaoh and the high priest have a particular, and this goes back to the mystery school teachings, a particular energy. Say they want to work with the energy of Sirius or the Pleiades, or they want to bring in the idea of Mars or Saturn. It's like they would set up what we would consider a pre-construction site, and they would call in the goddess Sashata, and they would actually have a high priest and priestess work as Thoth and Sashata, work with the pharaoh, and really meditate and bring in these coordinates for the highest alignment of the temple. So Sashata is very connected to the star Sirius, and she is also connected to Isis. She's really a star goddess, if you will, and we feel her energy very much around the Great Pyramids. She's, again, depicted in every temple, and usually all throughout Egypt, wherever you see Sashata, there's something about it being connected to a specific teaching that had to do with an initiation or a mystery school or something that was having to do with astronomy or astrology. I love Sashata, and she's this time of the year in the ancient Egyptian calendar. Calendar that had to do with the star Sirius. We know that the Nile rose, and when the Nile rose in ancient Egypt, it was considered the new year. So Sothis as Isis, Sashata, all of these different names for the archetypal idea that as the stars were important to Earth, as above, so below, that the temples in Egypt, the energy, the actual, physical, tangible energy of the temples rose and fell with this idea of the Nile. And certain temples were only, parts of certain temples were only used when the Nile would rise during the new year. So she is a very important goddess, and once again, she's not one that's well known, not as well known as Isis or Sekhmet or Hathor, but if you were an architect or you worked having to do with anything in terms of temple design, let's say, then you were very much tuned into the energy of Sashata. Writers also, she's sometimes shown with a just like Thoth, with the palette and the scribe's pen in her hand. I've taken people to Edfu, actually, and there's a little alcove in Edfu Temple where you can go and see a beautiful depiction of her on the wall. And it's kind of like people, kind of sneak in there and say a quick meditation and just kind of, feel the energy and then leave again. But it really is sort of your own little private moment there with Sashata. I love those little moments in Egypt.
Well, Mary, can you also tell us a little bit about the use of alchemy in ancient Egypt?
Well, yes, all of ancient Egypt, pretty much the name Egypt as we know it, the ancient land called Kemet, was all about alchemy. And in fact, the word alchemy comes from the name for ancient Egypt, which was Kemet. And the Egyptians believed, rightly so, as above, so below, and that their version of reality was not one-dimensional like ours is. They believed that everything was symbolic, hence we have the idea of the hieroglyphs and how they, again, can transport you into different realms just by looking at these pictographs. The idea of alchemy in Egypt was, let's take the temple, because it was widespread. An example of the temple, they would use stone. We already talked about the architecture being aligned with the stars. The different types of stone they would use. Stone carries properties. What they wanted to induce in the celebrant of these mysteries would be etched in the stones. They would use sound. They would use smells. They would use color. We think of ancient Egypt as kind of like the sandstone color of the temples, which it is now after thousands and thousands of years, but everything was colored and painted. The actual temples were brilliant colored. Nothing was sandstone like it is today. They were all painted. So we're looking at the beginnings of what we consider magic or alchemy and the healing process and all of that. It came from a very high level. They're talking about the transmutation of matter. Their alchemy is actually physics. What we get, if you watch the Mummy movie on TV or something today, what we get is like spells and mummies and potions, and that was such a degraded, that was like way into the Roman times of what became degraded of the ancient Egyptian alchemy. The beginnings of it were the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx and these ideas of these great masterful beings who had this high enlightened knowledge at pretty much the beginning of recorded time. Where did that come from, and how did they get it? Once again, that's one of the major mysteries of Egypt. Whether you look at it as, men came, gods who walked in from the west and settled in Egypt, or you think of it as people came in from the skies and settled Egypt, or it was just that these ancient Egyptians were perceptive and intuitive and highly motivated enough to bring in some very potent information during this window of time. We don't know. No one really knows. But the idea was that you can't argue with it. It was there, to the point that the Greeks came in droves when they could towards the end of the New Kingdom into Greco-Roman times, just so that they could sit at the feet of the Egyptians and learn all of this. I mean, we're looking at it 5, 6, 7,000 years later, but during the time period where, let's call it the alchemy, was an ongoing thing, we've got Greek scholars, we have Middle Eastern, Persian, Iranian, we have people from all over the known world coming into Egypt, and especially to Heliopolis, which was the city of the sun, the great temple at Heliopolis, to study and know these secrets. And that was the thing about Egypt. The Egyptian priesthood said, you can come, we don't turn anybody away, but you have to prove yourself. Like, we're not going to, it's not pearls before swine. You have to prove that you're worthy of the knowledge. Your heart has to be as light as a feather to be able to perceive this knowledge, hence the idea of the initiations. They didn't initiate you just to make your life difficult. They did it to prove that you were no longer connected to the third dimensional world. In other words, greed and jealousy and all of the vices of being human would not hold you back or hinder you from your search and your quest for enlightenment. And basically, that's still any religion that doesn't teach that is really not spiritual. It's just about greed and holding people back. If you teach people that there is growth and heart, and through that you attain wisdom and enlightenment, well, then I think you're worthy to call yourself a religion or a spiritual practice.
I want to ask you, Mary, a little bit about archaeology and specifically the culture of archaeology or archaeologists, because there seems to be quite a stigma attached to archaeology and the extent to which archaeologists are or are not open to how can I put it, the possibilities of
the
our
alternative theories.
origins. Sorry, Mary.
Yeah, I think I just paraphrased you there, but how orthodox archaeologists are not open to some of the more alternative theories.
Yes. Yes. I mean,
And,
even there was a news article earlier this week about a cave painting discovered in India, 10,000 years old, and it's quite clearly a cave painting of an alien, of some alien creatures, and a UFO.
hmm
And archaeologists are baffled by this, but anybody that looks at the cave painting would say, well, this is pretty obvious.
Right. Well, and again, archaeology, like any prescribed branch of science, has its rules that it has to follow. And I've known some pretty open-minded archaeologists, but most of them have to follow the company line, which is science. It's like it has to be very objectified, it has to be proven, it has to be researched. And if you fall out of line, if you color outside the lines, you fall out of grace with the powers that be, which means that you don't get recognized, you don't get published, you don't get recognized by the authority figures that are the head of that particular branch of science. And most archaeology is funded by big universities, or the days of private people funding archaeology is pretty done with because it's so expensive. And that was the 18th century, not the 21st century. But they really do have to toe the academic line. That's it, basically. And then they don't want to get branded by being for lack of a better word, a pyramidiot. They really can't have a lot of truck with what they consider fantasy, which is the UFO stuff, or Atlantis. And I've been going back and forth to Egypt for 20 years, and so it's a fine line between being an avid Egyptologist, which means I understand archaeology, and I get thrilled at the prospect of seeing how the history is actually being proven and moved back farther. So, in other words, the history of the world is changing as we know it. Just in our lifetimes, we're seeing all these amazing things. Now, the sad thing about science is that it takes them ages to catch up with all of that. So in other words, things are being discovered, and if you put two and two together, you can kind of say, oh yeah, great, cave painting. Oh yeah, okay, proves alien interaction with human beings. Great. Now, an archaeology person probably can't even fathom that for another 100 years or so, because there's nothing to support that evidence. So if they can't prove it, it doesn't exist. I mean, we all know that story about how the Catholic Church, the Catholic hierarchy, just forgave Galileo for being a heretic for saying that there were 9 planets or something. It's crazy, but science is always technology is always on the cutting edge, but the paradigms of moving thought sometimes take a longer time to catch up. John West says it's great. They were a lot smarter than we are. It's just we don't recognize that. The ancients knew a lot more than we give them credit.
We think that we're just progressing all of the time because we're continuing, we're moving forward, but in actual fact, that's not necessarily the case. Well, Mary, I want to thank you for such a wonderful interview. You're an incredibly smart and incredibly knowledgeable lady. We're running out of time, but before we wrap up, I do want you to just remind people of your website, how they can find out about scheduling an appointment with you at any point in the future. There is a profile for you on the Psychic Access Talk Radio website, and people can access you through that. But also tell people a little bit about how they might find out more about this fascinating trip you have planned later this year.
Okay, great. Well, they can contact me directly. My email is mlomando@bellsouth.net. They can contact me by just Googling my name, Mary Lomando, and the website and everything else pops up. They can find me through Psychic Access. They can call my number, which is the trip number, at 954-972-5891. And the itinerary and all the information is on my website. This special option, the immersion Luxor Abydos option that I'm speaking about, they need to talk to me personally about that, because that's pretty much for hand-picked people. It's a little different than the normal trip. But I would love to talk to anyone who's interested. It promises to be spiritual and fun at the same time.
Excellent. And I know you do these trips at other times, Mary, and trips to Peru, so people can find out what's planned by checking out your website. Well, Mary, thank you once again for joining us. It's been absolutely brilliant. I'll certainly be listening to the interview again because you covered so much. I want to listen again to absorb everything you've shared.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you all out there, and have a great evening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers. Get access. Psychic Access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.